"This is not your wedding," the mountain man grinned, "but you'll be my wife." The church doors slam open. A trembling bride stands at the altar, forced into marriage by a cruel saloon keeper while the whole town watches. Then, like thunder after silence, a rugged stranger steps from the snow, daring to defy every law and every man in that town. He's no preacher, no lawman, just a lonely trapper with a Bible in his pack and a rifle in his hand. But what he says next stops every heartbeat in the room. He's not just saving her, he's claiming a promise written long ago, one tied to land, justice, and a secret her dead husband left behind. Now hunted through the mountains, they'll fight more than cold and bullets. They'll face the sins of the past and the mercy of God. When faith and survival collide, will love be their salvation or their ruin? And when the snow settles, whose wedding will it truly be? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The autumn wind whistled through the gaps in Cold Creek's wooden church as Charlotte Hensley stood before the altar, her hands trembling beneath her threadbare gloves. The worn black dress she wore, her late husband's final gift, hung loose on her frame, a testament to months of grief and hardship. Around her, the pews creaked with the weight of townsfolk who had come not to celebrate, but to witness her shame. Jed Lawton's breath, heavy with whiskey, cut through the musty air. His self-satisfied smirk spoke of victory already claimed, of property acquired. Charlotte forced herself to stare straight ahead at the faded cross on the wall, trying to find strength in its weathered wood grain. Reverend Thomas Dobbins stood before them, his thin shoulders hunched beneath his fraying clerical collar. His fingers fumbled with the worn pages of his Bible, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the November chill. The preacher's eyes darted between Charlotte's pale face and Jed's imposing figure, his conscience warring with his fear. "Dearly beloved," Dobbins began, his voice barely carrying over the whispers and snickers from the crowd. "We are gathered here today." A woman in the front pew tittered behind her hand. "About time someone took her in, after what her brother-in-law did." "Hush now," another responded. "Though it ain't proper, her living alone in that cabin since John passed." Charlotte's cheeks burned. The words of the service washed over her like icy river water, each syllable drowning her deeper in despair. This wasn't marriage. It was surrender. Jed had made that clear enough when he'd presented her with the choice: wed him or watch as he foreclosed on John's mining claim, the last piece of her husband's dream. Reverend Dobbins paused, his aged voice catching. If any person present knows just cause why these two should not be joined. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church suddenly burst open with a thunderous crack that echoed like gunfire. Cold wind and swirling snow gusted into the sanctuary, extinguishing the nearest lanterns. There, framed in the doorway like an avenging angel, stood a tall figure. Oliver Boone stepped into the lamplight, snow dusting his buckskin jacket and dark beard. His rifle wasn't aimed, but his hand rested sure upon it. Boot heels struck solid against the wooden floorboards as he strode down the center aisle, his presence commanding attention without a word spoken. "I object," Oliver's deep voice carried clear and steady through the stunned silence. "This union is void under the law." Jed's face twisted with rage. "Who in blazes do you think you are, mountain man? This ain't your business." Oliver reached into his jacket, movements deliberate, and withdrew a folded paper. "I have here a letter from John Hensley himself, written before his death. It grants me legal authority to protect his widow's estate." He held the document high, its cream-colored surface catching the lamplight. "Charlotte Hensley is under my protection, by her late husband's written word." The congregation erupted in gasps and mutters. Charlotte swayed on her feet, her vision swimming as the impossible scene unfolded before her. John had known. Somehow he had known to prepare for this. "Lies," Jed snarled, lunging forward with hands curled into fists. "Some mountain trash with a forged paper ain't stopping this wedding." Oliver's rifle swept up smooth as silk, leveled at Jed's chest. "Step back, Lawton. The lady ain't property to be claimed." Reverend Dobbins found his voice at last, though it quavered. Perhaps we should examine the document's authenticity before proceeding." "There ain't gonna be no examining." Jed's hand dropped to his gun belt, but Oliver's stern gaze and unwavering rifle made him think better of it. "You're making a powerful enemy today, Boone." "Wouldn't be the first time," Oliver replied evenly. He turned to Charlotte, his expression softening. "Mrs. Hensley, you're free to go. No one here has the right to force you into marriage." The weight of the moment, the sudden shift from despair to hope, proved too much. Charlotte's world tilted sideways as her knees buckled. The last thing she felt was Oliver's strong arms catching her before darkness claimed her. When she came to, she was cradled against Oliver's chest as he carried her down the church steps. The evening air was sharp with coming snow, and whispers followed them like autumn leaves. "Did you see Lawton's face?" "Never thought I'd see the day someone stood up to him." "That mountain man's either brave or crazy. Reckon he's both." Charlotte's fingers clutched weakly at Oliver's jacket. "The letter," she whispered. "John really wrote it?" "He did." Oliver's voice rumbled low in his chest. "Found me in the mountains last spring, before the fever took him. Said he trusted me to look after you, if trouble came." He paused at the bottom of the steps. "I'm sorry I cut it so close. Trail was hard with the early snow." Tears slid down Charlotte's cheeks, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of despair. John's final act of love had saved her through this stranger's courage. "Thank you," she breathed. Oliver simply nodded, his eyes scanning the gathering dusk. Behind them, the church doors banged shut, and raised voices could be heard arguing inside. News would spread fast in Cold Creek tonight. No one had ever defied Jed Lawton so publicly before. "Best get you somewhere safe," Oliver said quietly. "Storm's coming, and not just the weather kind." The last rays of sunlight painted the snow-touched buildings in hues of gold and purple as Oliver carried Charlotte away from the church. Town dogs howled in the distance, and somewhere a shutter banged in the rising wind. Change had come to Cold Creek with the winter winds, and nothing would be the same after this day. Townsfolk stood in doorways and peered through windows as Oliver strode past with his precious burden. Many crossed themselves, others whispered prayers or gossip. The sound of breaking glass echoed from the direction of Lawton's saloon, followed by angry shouts. Charlotte pressed her face against Oliver's shoulder, breathing in the scent of pine and leather that clung to his jacket. "Where will we go?" she asked softly. "I've got a place," he answered, his steady pace never faltering. "Cabin just outside town, belonging to friends. You'll be safe there until we sort this out proper." The wind kicked up harder, driving the first heavy flakes of snow before it. As darkness settled over Cold Creek, lights began appearing in windows like earthbound stars. But in Jed Lawton's saloon, lanterns blazed bright as fury, and the sound of breaking furniture carried on the wind, a promise of violence yet to come. Oliver's boots crunched through the gathering snow, carrying Charlotte away from the church where her nightmare had nearly become reality. Behind them, the town buzzed with the evening's events, a hornet's nest kicked hard and promising retribution. But for now, in this moment between day and night, Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced since John's death. Hope. The last golden light faded from the snow-heavy clouds as Oliver bore her toward safety, his steps sure and strong against the rising storm. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this day had ended not in chains, but in freedom, not in despair, but in rescue. God's mercy had arrived on mountain-hardened boots, carrying a letter from beyond the grave and the promise of protection when it was needed most. The rising moon cast long shadows across Cold Creek's empty streets as Oliver guided his mule wagon behind the church. Charlotte lay bundled in blankets in the wagon bed, her consciousness drifting in and out like the swirling snowflakes around them. The wooden wheels creaked against the frozen ground, each turn bringing them further from the nightmare at the altar. Oliver worked quickly but carefully, securing their supplies and checking the harnesses. His trained eye caught movement in the shadows. Townfolk watching, wondering, waiting to see what would unfold. He kept his rifle close, knowing Jed Lawton's reputation for vengeance. Charlotte stirred as he adjusted the blankets around her. Her eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear clouding her face. "Wait," she whispered, her voice hoarse. I don't know you. How can I trust—" She tried to sit up, but weakness from her ordeal made her limbs unsteady. Oliver gently steadied her with one hand while reaching into his coat with the other. "Mrs. Hensley, your husband John was a good man. He guided me through these mountains during the war, saved my life more than once." The moonlight caught the cream-colored envelope he withdrew. "Before he passed, he left this with me. Said if trouble came, I was to watch over you." He handed her the sealed note, its paper worn soft at the edges from months of careful carrying. Charlotte's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Even in the dim light, she recognized John's careful handwriting. "My dearest Charlotte, if you're reading this, the fever has taken me, and trouble has found you. Oliver Boone is a man of honor, the finest scout I knew during the war. He knows these mountains better than any living soul, and his word, once given, is unbreakable. Trust him as I did. With endless love, John." Tears fell onto the paper, smearing the ink. Charlotte pressed the letter to her chest, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Oliver turned away, giving her privacy with her grief, while he finished securing their provisions. "The storm's getting worse," he said after a few moments. "We need to make for higher ground before the pass fills with snow. My cabin's about 6 hours' ride, assuming the weather holds." Charlotte wiped her eyes with her sleeve, straightening her spine despite her exhaustion. "Very well, Mr. Boone. I suppose I have little choice but to trust my husband's judgment." The mules pulled them out of town as sleet began to fall, the iron-shod wheels leaving twin tracks in the gathering white. Charlotte huddled deeper into the blankets, her wedding dress offering little protection against the bitter wind. The familiar buildings of Cold Creek fell away behind them, swallowed by darkness and driving snow. As they climbed into the foothills, the wagon swaying on the rough track, Charlotte's mind wandered back to the days after John's death. Her brother-in-law Thomas had appeared with his smooth words and false sympathy, offering to help with the estate. Before she knew what was happening, he had sold her debts to Jed Lawton, trading her future for drinking money. "He said it was for the best," she murmured half to herself. "Said a woman couldn't manage a mining claim alone?" Oliver glanced back at her words but didn't interrupt. Sometimes silence was the kindest response to pain. "I tried to fight it," Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger with anger. "Went to the sheriff, the bank, even the circuit judge. But Jed owns them all, one way or another. When he announced the wedding date..." She shuddered. "I thought I'd rather die than be bound to such a man." "John knew what kind of vultures circle when a woman's left alone," Oliver said quietly. That's why he came looking for me last spring. Said he had a feeling things might go wrong. The storm intensified as midnight approached, the wind howling through the pines like a hungry wolf. The mules struggled against the deepening snow, their breath steaming in the frozen air. Oliver realized they wouldn't make the cabin before dawn in these conditions. "We'll have to make camp," he called over his shoulder. "There's a sheltered spot ahead where the rock face curves. We can wait out the worst of it there." He guided the wagon into a natural alcove where towering granite walls blocked the worst of the wind. The mules stamped gratefully as he unhitched them, securing them under a crude lean-to he quickly constructed from canvas and pine boughs. "Here, ma'am." Oliver helped Charlotte down from the wagon, supporting her when her legs threatened to buckle. "We can shelter under the wagon. It's not much, but it'll keep the snow off." He worked efficiently, laying cedar boughs for bedding and building a small fire in the lee of the rock face. The flames cast dancing shadows as he heated coffee in a battered tin pot. Charlotte sat wrapped in blankets, watching him move about the camp with practiced ease. Everything about him spoke of competence and careful preparation, from his well-maintained gear to the extra supplies he'd brought for her comfort. "You've done this before," she observed. "Making camp in storms." Oliver nodded, passing her a cup of hot coffee. "Spent most of the last 10 years in these mountains, trapping, guiding, learning the ways of the land." He paused, adding softly, "Running from memories, truth be told." The fire popped and hissed as snow melted in its warmth. Charlotte sipped the strong coffee, feeling life flow back into her frozen limbs. "What memories, if you don't mind my asking?" "War ones, mostly." Oliver stared into the flames. "Lost my fiancée while I was away fighting. Raiders hit her family's farm." His jaw tightened. After that, civilization didn't hold much appeal. Charlotte understood all too well the need to flee from pain. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Oliver acknowledged her sympathy with a slight nod, then turned to check on the mules. When he returned, he removed his heavy coat and draped it over her shoulders despite her protests. "You need it more than I do, ma'am. I'm used to the cold." The coat carried his warmth and the scent of leather and pine smoke. Charlotte pulled it closer, touched by the simple kindness. "Thank you, Mr. Boone, for everything." He settled on the other side of the fire, his rifle across his knees. The storm raged above them, but in their sheltered nook, the worst of its fury passed overhead. Charlotte found herself watching as Oliver bowed his head, his lips moving in silent prayer. Something in his expression told her this wasn't a common occurrence. There was an awkwardness to his posture, like a man returning to a long-abandoned practice. Yet there was sincerity, too, and a deep yearning that touched her heart. When he finished, she asked softly, "Was that your first prayer in a while?" "Since the war," he admitted. "Figured tonight was a good time to start again. The Lord sent me to that church just in time. Seems right to thank him." The fire burned low as the night deepened. Charlotte drifted in and out of sleep, feeling strangely secure despite their precarious situation. Each time she woke, she found Oliver alert and watchful, his strong presence a shield against both the storm and her fears. As the first pale light of dawn crept into their shelter, the snow began to ease. The world around them lay transformed, pristine white stretching as far as the eye could see. Oliver helped Charlotte back into the wagon, making sure she was warm and comfortable before hitching up the mules. "The worst of the storm's past," he said, checking the harnesses one final time. "We should make the cabin by mid-morning." He paused, meeting her eyes steadily. "You're safe now, ma'am. I give you my word on that." Something in his quiet certainty eased the last of Charlotte's doubts. This strange alliance, born of her late husband's foresight, and this mountain man's honor, felt right in a way she couldn't explain. As the wagon began to move through the fresh snow, she found herself thinking that perhaps God's grace could appear in unexpected forms, even in the shape of a rough-hewn protector sent to rescue her on her darkest day. The rising sun painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold, its warmth a promise of hope after the long, cold night. Charlotte held John's letter close to her heart as they continued their journey, grateful for his final gift of protection and for the chance to begin anew. The morning sun glinted off fresh snow as Oliver's wagon crested the final ridge. Below them, nestled in a protected valley, stood his cabin. The rough-hewn logs gleamed golden in the light, and a thin spiral of smoke rose from the stone chimney into the crystal-clear mountain air. Charlotte straightened on the wagon seat, taking in the sight. The cabin wasn't large, but it had been built with evident care. A neat woodpile stood stacked against the north wall, and a small barn waited nearby for the mules. Everything spoke of solitude and self-sufficiency. "Home," Oliver said simply, guiding the mules down the gentle slope. The wagon runners cut fresh tracks through the unmarred snow, the only sign of human presence in the pristine landscape. As they drew closer, Charlotte noticed more details. A mountain stream gurgled nearby, partially frozen, but still flowing beneath the ice. Pine and aspen trees sheltered the cabin from the worst of the winds, their branches heavy with snow. It was a beautiful place, she had to admit. Lonely, perhaps, but peaceful. Oliver helped her down from the wagon, his strong hands steady as her feet touched the packed earth of the yard. "Best get you inside where it's warm," he said. "I'll tend to the mules." The cabin door creaked softly as Charlotte pushed it open. Warmth and the scent of pine pitch welcomed her, along with the familiar aroma of coffee left warming on the back of the cast-iron stove. The single room was neat but spare, telling its own story of solitary living. Her eyes traced the simple furnishings: one sturdy chair pulled up to a wooden table, a single plate and cup resting in the dish drain. A well-worn Bible lay closed on the stone mantel, dust on its cover suggesting it hadn't been opened in some time. The sight made her heart ache with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Not pity, exactly, but a deep understanding of what it meant to be alone. A narrow ladder led to a sleeping loft above, and a patchwork quilt hung as a makeshift curtain across one corner, presumably hiding storage space. Everything had its place, yet the cabin felt more like a shelter than a home. Charlotte removed her cloak, still damp from the journey, and hung it near the stove to dry. After the tension of the past days, the simple act of warming her hands at the stove felt like luxury. She found herself wanting to do something, anything, to repay Oliver's kindness. The sound of hooves and creaking leather drifted through the walls as Oliver unhitched the mules and led them to the barn. Charlotte took advantage of his absence to explore the kitchen area. She found a pot of stew hanging at the back of the stove. Simple fare, but nourishing. Without hesitation, she began gathering what she needed to set the table. When Oliver returned, stamping snow from his boots, he paused in the doorway. Charlotte had found 2 bowls, she suspected rarely used, and had set them out with spoons and cups for coffee. "You didn't need to do that, ma'am," he said, but there was a note of appreciation in his voice. "Please," she replied. "It's the least I can do." She ladled the hot stew into bowls while he poured coffee. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crack of the fire and the occasional cry of a winter bird outside. After the meal, Charlotte insisted on washing the dishes. Oliver watched her for a moment, then went to add wood to the fire. The domestic scene felt strange to them both. Like actors performing unfamiliar roles in a play neither had rehearsed. As Charlotte dried the last bowl, she finally voiced the question that had been nagging at her since their dramatic departure from Cold Creek. "Mr. Boone," she began, setting the dish aside, "what did you mean about the letter? Back at the church you mentioned something my husband left." Oliver nodded, as if he'd been expecting this. He crossed to his coat, hanging by the door, and withdrew a folded paper from an inner pocket. The page was wrinkled and worn at the creases, suggesting he'd carried it for some time. "John came to see me last spring," he explained, running a thumb along the paper's edge. "Said he had a feeling things might go wrong at the mine. Wanted to make sure you'd be protected if anything happened to him." He held out the letter. Charlotte took it with trembling fingers, recognizing her husband's distinctive handwriting. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clear. "Dear Oliver, if you're reading this, I reckon I'm gone. I'm asking you to do what I can't anymore. Guard Charlotte and the land. You're the only man I trust to do right by both. The claim's good, but there are those who'd try to take advantage. Keep her safe, friend. It's my last request. John Hensley." Charlotte read the words twice, then 3 times. Tears blurred her vision as she traced her husband's signature. "He knew," she whispered. Somehow he knew what Thomas would do. "John was a good judge of character," Oliver said quietly. "He saved my life during the war, did you know that? Led me through Union lines when I was cut off from my unit. Said he never forgot a debt, but truth is, I'm the one who owes him." Charlotte carefully refolded the letter. "And now you're repaying that debt by protecting me." "It's more than debt, ma'am." Oliver's voice was firm. "It's about doing what's right. No decent man could stand by and watch what they tried to do to you." The afternoon light began to fade, shadows lengthening across the cabin floor. Oliver busied himself with evening chores, while Charlotte sat in the single chair, lost in thought. The letter had changed something between them, making their strange situation feel more real, more permanent. As night fell, Oliver showed her to the sleeping loft. "It's not much," he apologized, "but you'll be comfortable enough. I've put fresh straw in the tick, and there are extra blankets if you need them." "Where will you sleep?" Charlotte asked, though she could guess the answer. "By the hearth. Been sleeping there since I built this place." He gave her a reassuring nod. "Rest easy, ma'am. You're safe here." Charlotte climbed the ladder to the loft, carrying a small oil lamp. The space was clean and simply furnished with a narrow bed. She changed into a nightgown she'd managed to grab before leaving Cold Creek, grateful for small mercies. Below, she could hear Oliver moving quietly, banking the fire for the night. The familiar sounds of evening routine, wood settling, coffee pot being moved, boots being removed, created an unexpected sense of security. From her vantage point, she could see him spread his bedroll near the hearth, rifle within easy reach. He added another log to the fire, then settled down, pulling a worn blanket over himself. Outside, coyotes began their nightly chorus, their eerie songs echoing across the valley. The sound would have frightened her once, but tonight it seemed fitting, wild and lonely, yet somehow beautiful. The firelight flickered below, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Charlotte lay in the darkness, watching the play of light and shadow. She and Oliver were strangers still, bound together by a dead man's wishes and a sense of duty. Trust would come later, if it came at all. For now they were like the coyotes' song, separate voices finding harmony in the night. The letter crinkled softly in her hand, where she'd tucked it under her pillow. John's last gift to her hadn't been what she expected, but perhaps it was exactly what she needed. Not just protection, but a chance to start over, to find her own strength in these mountains. As sleep began to claim her, Charlotte heard Oliver's quiet voice rise in prayer, so soft she almost missed it. This time the words seemed to come more naturally to him, as if the act of protecting her had awakened something long dormant in his soul. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. In the loft above, Charlotte drifted off to sleep, while below, Oliver kept his vigil. Two strangers sharing a space, their futures intertwined by a letter and a promise, waiting to see what tomorrow would bring in this mountain sanctuary. Back in Cold Creek, Jed Lawton stalked the length of his empty saloon, boots leaving muddy tracks on the wooden floor. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows through grimy windows. The wedding decorations still hung limply from the rafters, a mockery of his failed scheme. He grabbed a whiskey bottle from behind the bar and poured himself a generous measure, spilling drops on his wedding suit. The liquor burned, but did nothing to ease his rage. The mountain man's interference had cost him more than a bride. It had cost him his reputation. "Nobody makes a fool of Jed Lawton," he muttered, hurling the empty glass against the wall. It shattered with a satisfying crash. The saloon's doors creaked open, admitting Marshal Henry Tate. The lawman's silver badge caught the fading light as he removed his snow-dusted hat. "Quite a show at the church today," he drawled, settling his considerable bulk onto a bar stool. Jed's eyes narrowed. "Glad you found it entertaining, Marshal." He pulled out another glass and filled it, sliding it across the bar. "Maybe you'd like to explain why you didn't arrest that mountain savage for disrupting a legal ceremony?" Tate took a long drink before answering. "Legal's a funny word, Jed, especially when it comes to forced marriages." He set the glass down carefully. "Besides, that Boone fellow had some kind of paper. Said it gave him authority over the widow's affairs." "Paper can be changed," Jed said quietly, reaching beneath the bar. He withdrew a leather pouch that clinked heavily. "Just like a marshal's opinion can be changed." Pushed the pouch across the polished wood. Tate's fingers closed around the bag. He didn't need to count it. The weight told him enough. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "That mining claim's worth a fortune," Jed said, leaning forward. "Charlotte's husband never filed the proper papers, never paid his fees. The territories owed quite a sum in back taxes." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Shame if someone had to collect." The marshal pocketed the pouch. "Might take some time to find the right documents. Territories' records are a mess these days. I'm sure you'll manage." Jed poured them both another drink. "And while you're at it, that mountain man kidnapped a respectable widow, carried her off against her will, right in front of God and everybody." He raised his glass. "Sounds like a serious crime to me." Tate nodded slowly. "Could be, especially if there were witnesses willing to swear to it." "Oh, there will be." Jed's grin widened. "Soon as I spread the word that drinks are on the house for anyone who helps bring her back." The marshal finished his whiskey and stood. "I'll have those notices posted by morning. But Boone's no fool. He'll have her deep in those mountains by now." "Then we'll smoke them out." Jed's fist tightened around his glass. "Nobody takes what's mine." As Tate left, the saloon fell silent except for the wind rattling the windows. Jed remained at the bar, plotting his revenge while the shadows lengthened across the floor. Across town, in the small wooden church, Reverend Thomas Dobbins knelt before the altar. The building still smelled of crushed flowers from the interrupted wedding. Candle stubs flickered in their holders, casting uncertain light on the man's bowed head. "Lord," he whispered, "forgive my weakness. I nearly performed a ceremony I knew was wrong." His thin shoulders shook. "I should have spoken up sooner. Should have done something." The door hinges squeaked behind him. Dobbins turned to see several townspeople entering. Mrs. Peterson from the general store, old Jim Walker who ran the livery, and young Tom Baker who worked the telegraph office. "Reverend," Mrs. Peterson said softly, "we've been talking about what happened today." Dobbins rose stiffly, brushing dust from his knees. "Have you come to pray as well?" "We've come to ask what you think," Jim Walker said. "Was that mountain man right to do what he did? Or was he just causing trouble?" The Reverend was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "I think," he began, "I think sometimes the Lord works in unexpected ways, through unexpected people." "But he had a gun in church," Mrs. Peterson protested, "and he took that poor widow." "Did he take her?" Tom Baker interrupted. "Or did he save her? We all saw how she trembled, how Jed grabbed her arm when she tried to step back." The group fell silent, remembering. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the church's loose shingles. "I've known Charlotte Hensley since she came to town," Dobbins said finally. "She's a good woman, a Christian woman, and I've never seen her show fear like she did today, until that mountain man stepped in." "But what about the law?" Jim Walker asked. "Marshall's bound to get involved now." "The law of man isn't always the law of God," the Reverend replied, his voice stronger now. "Sometimes we must choose which to follow." As the townsfolk debated, their voices echoing in the empty church, another scene was unfolding at the edge of town. Isaac Red Elk, wrapped in a thick wool trade blanket, sat astride his paint horse in the shelter of a cottonwood grove. His dark eyes missed nothing as he watched Marshall Tate emerge from the saloon and head toward his office. The Cherokee trader had been about to leave town when he'd overheard fragments of conversation through the saloon's back window. Now he studied the troubled expressions of people passing on the street, noting how they gathered in small groups to whisper and argue. Isaac knew Oliver Boone well, had guided him through Cherokee territory more than once. The mountain man was no kidnapper, but he was in danger, and he needed to be warned. Adjusting his hat against the rising wind, Isaac turned his horse toward the mountain trails. Snow was beginning to fall again, thick flakes that would soon blanket the ground. Good. It would cover his tracks, and Oliver's. The trader smiled slightly as he urged his mount forward. White men often underestimated the bond between mountain folk and the Cherokee. They didn't understand that news traveled fast along the hidden paths between settlements and tribal lands. That favors were remembered and debts repaid without need for contracts or coins. Oliver had once helped Isaac's family during a harsh winter, sharing meat and medicine without asking anything in return. Now it was time to return that kindness. The snow fell harder as Isaac rode, erasing the world behind him. By morning, any trace of his passing would be gone. The same snow would hide the trail to Oliver's cabin, giving the mountain man and his charge time to prepare for what was coming. Back in town, Marshall Tate sat at his desk, ink-stained fingers hovering over official paper. The weight of Jed's gold pressed against his chest where he'd hidden the pouch in his inner pocket. With a steady hand, he began to write. Notice of debt and seizure territory of Colorado Ree mining claim, Jup 1847. Holder, John Hensley, deceased, outstanding taxes and fees. He paused, considering the amount. It needed to be high enough to justify immediate action, but not so outrageous as to draw unwanted attention from territorial authorities. Finally, he wrote a sum that would make Charlotte Hensley's inheritance worthless unless she had a wealthy protector, like Jed Lawton. On another sheet, he drafted a second notice, wanted for questioning Oliver Boone for the forcible removal and suspected abduction of Mrs. Charlotte Hensley. Outside his office, the town slowly settled into evening. Lamps flickered to life in windows. The saloon began to fill with men drawn by Jed's promise of free drinks. men who would soon be willing to swear to any version of events that kept the whiskey flowing. The snow fell steadily now, erasing tracks and softening edges. It covered the town like a blank page, waiting to see what story would be written next. But up in the mountains, where Oliver's cabin stood against the gathering storm, the snow served a different purpose. It was a curtain of protection, a temporary shield against the schemes being laid in the valley below. Isaac Red Elk pressed on through the deepening dusk, following tracks only he could see. The paint horse picked its way surely along the rising trail, steam puffing from its nostrils. The trader pulled his blanket closer, watching the snow erase his passage. "The storm is your friend tonight, brother," he murmured in Cherokee, thinking of Oliver. "May it keep you safe until I bring word." The mountain darkness gathered around him as he rode on, while below in Cold Creek, Jed Lawton's revenge began taking shape like ice forming on a winter river. Cold, hard, and dangerous. The mountain cabin settled into a gentle rhythm as days passed, each sunrise bringing new tasks and quiet understanding. Charlotte woke early, the pine-scented air crisp through the loft's small window. Below, she could hear Oliver's boots on the wooden floor as he prepared for his morning rounds. Dawn painted the cabin's interior in soft grays and golds. Charlotte smoothed her skirts, noting the torn hem she'd need to mend. The simple act of planning such ordinary work gave her comfort, so different from the desperate fear that had driven her here just days ago. Oliver looked up as she descended the ladder, nodding his usual quiet greeting. "Coffee's hot," he said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Storm's let up some. Might check the rabbit snares today." "Thank you," Charlotte replied, wrapping her shawl tighter. She'd learned his ways these past days, how he spoke more with gesture than words, how his actions showed consideration his voice rarely expressed. The cabin had seemed stark at first, but now she saw its careful order. Everything had its place, the stack of split wood by the hearth, dried herbs hanging from rafters, tin cups lined neatly on their shelf. Oliver's rifle stood ready by the door, not threatening but protective, like the man himself. While he worked outside, Charlotte found purpose in small tasks. She discovered needle and thread in a wooden box and set about mending tears in both their clothing. The familiar rhythm of stitching soothed her, each neat row a tiny victory over disorder. Through the window, she watched Oliver at the woodpile. His axe rose and fell in steady strokes, the sound echoing across the snowy clearing. Chips of pine scattered like gold in the morning light. He worked with the same quiet focus he brought to everything. Methodical, thorough, unhurried. When he returned with an armload of wood, she had hot coffee waiting. "Much obliged," he said, stamping snow from his boots. Their fingers brushed as she passed him the cup, and Charlotte felt a flutter of something that wasn't quite fear. The days developed their own pattern. Oliver would check his trap lines in the morning, returning with rabbits or sometimes a grouse. Charlotte learned to skin and clean the game, her hands growing surer with practice. She found satisfaction in contributing to their meals, in making the cabin more homelike with small touches. A swept hearth, fresh pine boughs in the corner, yesterday's dishes washed and gleaming. One afternoon, as she worked at the wood stove, the heavy iron lid slipped. Charlotte gasped as it caught her hand, leaving an angry red welt across her palm. She bit back tears, not wanting to seem weak. But Oliver had heard. He crossed the cabin in 2 strides, taking her burned hand in his weathered ones. Without a word, he led her to the wash basin, holding her hand in the cool water. Then he reached for a jar of salve, something that smelled of pine and herbs. "Cherokee medicine," he explained, spreading it gently across the burn. Isaac Red Elk's people taught me about healing plants. His touch was surprisingly delicate for such large hands, and Charlotte found herself studying his down-turned face as he worked. Lines creased the corners of his eyes, from squinting into mountain distances, she supposed. His beard was flecked with gray, but his movements held the sure strength of a man in his prime. When he finished wrapping her hand in a clean cloth, his fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," Charlotte said softly. She felt the weight of his concern in his silence, worth more than any words of comfort. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, the storm returned with fresh fury. Wind howled through the pines, and snow hissed against the windows. Charlotte stirred the stew she'd made, grateful for the sturdy walls around them. "Might be cut off for a spell," Oliver observed, banking the fire for the night. "Storm like this, trail down to town will be impassable." Charlotte nodded, trying to hide her relief. She wasn't ready to face whatever waited below. Here, in this simple cabin with its quiet guardian, she'd found a peace she hadn't known she needed. They shared supper by lamplight, the stew warming them against the storm's chill. Oliver had grown more talkative as days passed, sharing bits of his life in the mountains, stories of seasons spent trapping, of friendship with the Cherokee, of lessons learned from solitude. "Never meant to stay up here permanent-like," he admitted, sopping up the last of his stew with a piece of cornbread. "Came after the war, looking for peace maybe. Found it had its own kind of healing." Charlotte understood. She'd seen how the mountain's rhythms worked on troubled spirits, how its silence could calm the heart's noise. Even the endless white of snow brought clarity, a clean page where new stories could begin. That night, unable to sleep, Charlotte heard movement below. Peering through the loft railings, she saw Oliver kneeling by the hearth, head bowed in prayer. His whispered words carried faintly. "Lord, you know I ain't been much for talking lately, but I reckon you brought her here for purpose. Help me do right by her. Keep her safe until your plan shows clear." Charlotte lay back, something warm and unexpected spreading through her chest. She'd seen his decency in 100 small ways, but this unguarded moment revealed the depth of his faith. Not showy or formal, but as natural as breathing. The next morning dawned bright and cold. Fresh snow blanketed the world, transforming the forest into a cathedral of white-draped pines. Oliver checked his trap lines as usual, while Charlotte swept the cabin and started a pot of beans. She found herself humming as she worked, an old hymn her mother used to sing. The simple task of stirring beans and kneading cornbread dough felt like reclaiming pieces of herself. Each small act of homemaking was a step away from the frightened woman who'd fled up this mountain. When Oliver returned, snow crusting his coat and a brace of rabbits in hand, Charlotte saw him with new eyes. Not just her protector now, but a man of quiet strength and deeper waters than she'd guessed. He moved through his tasks with careful attention, skinning the rabbits, cleaning his rifle, carrying in more wood before the next storm could hit. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Charlotte darning a sock while Oliver whittled a new handle for his axe, she felt the rightness of this simple peace. The wind sang in the chimney, and lamplight made soft shadows dance on the walls. Neither spoke much, but the silence was comfortable now, full of understanding. Later, banking the fire for the night, Oliver paused. His face was serious in the fading light. "Long as you need sanctuary here," he said quietly, "you have it, until God himself says otherwise." Charlotte met his eyes, seeing the vow behind the words. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing it wasn't enough to express what she felt. As she climbed to her loft, the cabin settled around them with familiar creaks and sighs. Outside, Snow continued to fall, cutting them off from the world below. But here, in this place of refuge, Charlotte felt something new taking root. Trust, perhaps, or hope, or both. Oliver remained by the fire, his silent prayer rising with the smoke. To be worthy of this trust, to protect what God had placed in his care. The mountain night deepened around the cabin, while inside, two souls found healing in the simple grace of shared days and growing faith. Through the window, stars pierced the clearing storm, like distant promises. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and quiet moments. For now, peace reigned in the cabin among the pines, where fear had given way to something gentler, and two hearts began to recognize the hand of Providence in their unlikely meeting. The winter sun had climbed to its highest point when Oliver heard it, the soft thud of hoofbeats echoing through the snow-filled valley. He set down his axe and moved swiftly to the cabin's door, rifle ready in his weathered hands. Charlotte looked up from her mending, tension creeping into her shoulders. They hadn't seen another soul since arriving at the cabin, and visitors weren't likely to bring good news. "Stay inside," Oliver said quietly, positioning himself by the window. The familiar weight of his Winchester felt reassuring as he tracked the approaching rider through the scope. The figure emerged from the tree line, wrapped in a thick buffalo coat crusted with snow. Relief washed over Oliver's face as he recognized the distinctive way the rider sat his horse. Straight-backed but relaxed, moving in perfect rhythm with his mount. "Isaac," he called out, lowering his rifle. "Come on up, friend." Charlotte appeared at his shoulder, curious but cautious. She'd heard Oliver mention the Cherokee trader before, but hadn't met him. Isaac Red Elk guided his paint horse through the deep snow, his dark eyes taking in everything with calm awareness. He dismounted with fluid grace, leading his horse to the shelter of the lean-to where Oliver's mule stood. "Brother," Isaac greeted, clasping Oliver's extended hand. His voice carried the hint of a smile. "Thought I might find you up here." He turned to Charlotte with a small bow. "Miss Hensley, your reputation for courage travels faster than winter storms." Charlotte blushed at the unexpected compliment. "Please, come in from the cold, Mr. Red Elk." "Isaac," he corrected gently. "We're all friends here." Inside the cabin, Charlotte stirred the pot of rabbit stew she'd been keeping warm on the back of the stove. Oliver and Isaac settled at the rough-hewn table, steam rising from the coffee cups between them. "Brought news from town," Isaac said, warming his hands around his cup. "Not good news, I'm afraid." Oliver's jaw tightened. "Jed?" Isaac nodded. "He's got the marshal in his pocket now. They've posted wanted notices all over Cold Creek, claiming you kidnapped Miss Hensley and that she owes debts on her husband's mining claim." Charlotte's hand flew to her throat. "But that's not true. My Thomas paid every debt he owed. I have the papers to prove it." "Papers may not matter much," Isaac said carefully. "Marshal Tate's been taking Jed's whiskey money for years. Now he's offering rewards to anyone who brings you back to town." Oliver's eyes darkened. Tate was a good lawman once. Shame what greed does to a man's soul. Isaac leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "You'll need more than righteousness to fight this, brother. They'll try to take the land through legal channels first. Do you have proof of ownership? Something that can't be disputed?" Charlotte set bowls of stew before them, her mind racing. "Thomas kept everything important in his strongbox. Deeds, contracts, letters. But I haven't seen it since." She trailed off, remembering the chaos after her husband's death. "Where was it last?" Oliver asked between careful spoonfuls of the steaming stew. "In our bedroom, under the floorboards." Charlotte's eyes widened. "The trunk! I brought Thomas's trunk when I fled my brother-in-law's house. It's up in the loft." They finished their meal quickly. Then Charlotte led the men up the ladder to the sleeping loft. The battered trunk sat in the corner, its leather straps cracked with age. She opened it with trembling fingers, revealing carefully folded clothes and a few precious books. "Help me look," she said, lifting out her husband's things one by one. Each item carried memories. His Sunday shirt, still starched, the pocket watch that no longer ticked, letters she'd written him during his prospecting trips. Oliver and Isaac joined her search, treating each item with gentle respect. The afternoon light faded as they worked, and Oliver lit the lamp to continue. "Wait," Charlotte said suddenly. She ran her hands along the trunk's bottom, pressing here and there. "Thomas always said a man needs a secret place." There was a soft click, and a section of the wooden floor lifted away, revealing a hidden compartment. The strongbox nestled inside, its iron sides dark with age. Charlotte lifted it out with reverent hands, setting it on the floor between them. "The key," she whispered. "He always wore it on a chain." She reached into her dress and pulled out a thin silver chain. A small key dangled from it, catching the lamplight. The lock turned with a solid chunk. Inside, they found several folders of papers, carefully tied with faded ribbon. Charlotte's hands shook as she opened the first one. "The deed to the mine," she said, scanning the document. "And here's proof Thomas paid off the mortgage to the bank." She passed these to Oliver, who studied them with Isaac looking over his shoulder. "These are solid," Isaac confirmed. "No one can dispute your ownership with these papers." But Charlotte barely heard him. She'd opened another folder and sat staring at its contents, her face pale in the lamplight. "What is it?" Oliver asked softly. "I don't understand," she said. "This is a trust document. Thomas made me trustee of a fund for orphaned minors' children." She looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He never told me." Oliver took the paper she held out, reading aloud in the quiet loft. "This trust, established for the care and education of children left parentless by mining accidents, shall be administered by Charlotte Rose Hensley, with all profits from the North Star mine claimed to be divided equally between maintenance of said claim and support of the Orphans Fund." Isaac's expression grew grave. "Now we know why Jed wants the land so badly. There's more than gold at stake here." Charlotte pressed her hands to her face. "All those children, I had no idea. The mine's profits were meant to help them, not fill Jed's pockets." Oliver reached out, touching her shoulder gently. "This changes everything. We're not just protecting your property now, we're defending those kids' future." "And that gives us leverage," Isaac added. "Even a corrupt marshal will think twice before stealing from orphans. Once people in town know the truth about the trust, they'll stand with you." Charlotte squared her shoulders, drawing strength from their words. "Thomas believed in me enough to make me trustee. I won't let him, or those children, down." They carefully repacked the strongbox, Oliver insisting it be hidden under the loft floorboards rather than returned to the trunk. "Best not keep all our proof in one place," he said. As they descended from the loft, the winter evening had drawn its purple shadows close around the cabin. Isaac declined their invitation to stay the night, saying he needed to return to town while the weather held. "I'll spread the word about the trust," he promised, mounting his horse, "quietly, to those we can trust. Give people time to think about what's right." Oliver walked him to the edge of the clearing. "Watch your back, brother. Jed won't take kindly to the truth getting out." Isaac's smile was fierce in the gathering dusk. "Let him come. I've faced worse than saloon bullies in my time." He touched his heels to his horse's flanks, melting into the forest shadows like a spirit. Back inside, Charlotte stood by the fire, still holding the trust document. Oliver watched her face in the flickering light, seeing determination replace fear in her eyes. "I never wanted this responsibility," she said softly. "But Thomas knew. He knew I'd fight for those children, even if I wouldn't fight for myself." Oliver added wood to the fire, letting the silence stretch comfortable between them. Finally, he spoke. "Your husband was a wise man. He saw your strength, same as I do." Charlotte looked up, meeting his steady gaze. In that moment, something shifted between them. A deepening of trust, a recognition of shared purpose. They were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance, but partners in a cause greater than themselves. The fire crackled, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny stars. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, carrying the first sense of another approaching storm. But inside the cabin, warmth and resolve held firm against the gathering night. Morning light streamed through the cabin windows, casting golden squares on the rough-hewn floor. After days of relentless snow and wind, the storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline silence. Charlotte stood at the window, her breath fogging the glass as she marveled at the pristine blanket of white stretching toward the tree line. "Reckon we ought to fetch more water while the weather holds," Oliver said, pulling on his heavy coat. "Stream's not far. Might do us good to stretch our legs a bit." Charlotte nodded eagerly, grateful for a chance to venture outside after being cooped up for so long. She wrapped herself in her shawl and borrowed mittens, following Oliver out into the dazzling morning. The snow crunched beneath their boots as Oliver led the way, carrying 2 empty buckets. Charlotte noticed how he deliberately shortened his usual long stride to match her pace. The air was crisp and clean, filling her lungs with invigorating cold. Everything sparkled, tree branches draped in white, icicles catching light like prisms. Even the sky seemed to shimmer with an intense, clear blue. "Mind your step here," Oliver cautioned, as they descended a gentle slope. "Ice under all this fresh powder." No sooner had he spoken than Charlotte's foot slipped. She caught herself, arms windmilling, and let out a surprised laugh. The sound seemed to startle them both. It was the first time she'd laughed since arriving at the cabin. "My Mr. Boone," she said, eyes twinkling. "You don't waste any chance to prove yourself right, do you?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Just trying to keep you upright, ma'am." "Always so serious," she teased, falling into step beside him again. "I don't believe I've seen you smile properly once since we met." "Been told I've got a face better suited to frowning," he replied. But there was a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. They reached the stream, now mostly frozen over except for a narrow channel in the middle, where dark water still flowed. Oliver used his axe to break through the ice at a shallow spot, creating a hole large enough to dip the buckets. "Might as well rest a spell before heading back," he said, brushing snow off a fallen log. He pulled a cloth-wrapped package from his coat pocket. "Brought some biscuits, if you're hungry." Charlotte settled beside him on the log, accepting a biscuit gratefully. The sun had risen higher now, making the snow-covered landscape almost too bright to look at. Tiny ice crystals drifted in the air, catching the light like diamond dust. "It's beautiful up here," she said softly. "So peaceful. I can see why you chose this place." Oliver was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "Wasn't always peaceful for me. Came here running from things, same as you. But the mountains, they have a way of healing what's broken, if you let them." Charlotte studied his profile, noting how the sunlight softened his usual stern expression. "And did they heal you?" "Some," he admitted. "More since you arrived, truth be told." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. Charlotte felt her cheeks warm despite the cold, and she turned her attention back to the glittering stream. They finished their biscuits in comfortable silence, watching snow fall from branches in soft clumps when the breeze stirred. A pair of chickadees flitted nearby, their cheerful calls the only sound besides the gurgling water. The walk back was easier, their boots following their earlier tracks. Oliver carried both filled buckets despite Charlotte's protests that she could help. She noticed how he kept glancing at her, as if making sure she was still there, still safe. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was past its peak. They spent the afternoon making preparations for the coming days, both aware that their peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. The trust papers weighed heavily on their minds. "We need somewhere safer than the loft boards," Oliver said, studying the cabin floor with a carpenter's eye. "Somewhere they won't think to look, even if they search the place." Charlotte watched as he selected several boards near the hearth, testing each one with his boot. "Here," he decided. "Close enough to the heat that the wood's likely to creak some anyway. Won't sound hollow if they stomp around looking." He worked methodically, using his tools to carefully pry up 3 boards. Beneath them, he fashioned a clever compartment, complete with a false bottom that would fool anyone who didn't know exactly where to press. The craftsmanship was impressive, and Charlotte said as much. "My pa was a carpenter," Oliver explained, fitting the boards back into place so perfectly you'd never know they'd been moved. "Taught me every trick he knew about working wood. Never thought I'd use those skills to hide legal papers, though." Charlotte brought the strongbox down from the loft, and together they transferred the trust documents to their new hiding place. Oliver's hands were gentle with the papers, treating them with the same reverence he showed his Bible. As evening approached, they settled into what had become their routine. Charlotte prepared a simple supper, while Oliver tended to outdoor chores. They ate together at the small table, sharing the day's observations and concerns. But tonight felt different, warmer somehow, as if their morning's adventure had shifted something between them. After the dishes were cleared, Charlotte reached for the Bible that sat on the mantel. It had become her habit to read a passage each evening, though usually Oliver listened from his chair by the fire. Tonight, however, he moved his seat closer as she opened to the Book of Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd," she began, her voice soft but clear in the firelit room. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." To her surprise, Oliver's deep voice joined hers for the familiar words. "He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." Charlotte glanced up, meeting his eyes over the pages. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared faith, of trust deeper than mere circumstances. She continued reading, their voices twining together in the ancient words of comfort and promise. When the last verse faded, neither spoke for a long moment. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its voice carrying clear and haunting through the winter night. "Been a while since I read scripture with anyone," Oliver said finally. "Forgot how it feels, sharing God's word." Charlotte closed the Bible gently, running her fingers over its worn leather cover. "Thank you for joining me. It means more, somehow, not reading alone." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Reckon there's a lot of things that mean more when they're shared." The simplicity of his words touched something in Charlotte's heart. She thought about their morning walk, his careful attention to her safety, the way he'd worked so diligently to protect not just her, but the legacy her husband had left for the orphaned children. This quiet man, with his gruff manner and gentle heart, had become more than just her protector. They sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned low. Oliver added another log, and Charlotte took up her mending, but neither felt the need to fill the quiet with words. There was a peace in the cabin that hadn't been there before, a warmth that had nothing to do with the hearth. Later, as Charlotte climbed the ladder to her loft bed, she paused. "Thank you for today, Mr. Boone. For everything." "Oliver," he said softly. "Reckon you might call me Oliver now." She smiled in the darkness. "Good night then, Oliver." "Good night, Charlotte." She lay awake for a while, listening to his quiet movements below as he banked the fire and settled into his bedroll. The day's memories played through her mind. Sunshine on snow, shared laughter, the harmony of their voices reading psalms together. For the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something unfurling in her heart, like a flower turning toward the sun. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the possibility of love, modest and gentle as the man himself. And for tonight, that was enough. Isaac Red Elk's pony picked its way carefully through Cold Creek's muddy streets. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows between the buildings, and the Cherokee trader kept his movements casual as he tied his mount outside the general store. His real destination was the saloon across the street, where Jed Lawton's voice carried through the swinging doors. Inside, cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. Isaac settled at a corner table, ordering coffee and appearing to study a handful of trade receipts. His keen ears, however, were focused on the conversation at the bar. "Got it all worked out legal-like," Jed was saying to a cluster of men. "That mountain man ain't properly married to her, which means she's still bound by her dead husband's debts to me." He tapped a stack of papers on the bar. "Marshal Tate here's already signed the orders." The marshal, glassy-eyed from whiskey, nodded. "Territory law's clear on this. Woman can't hold property without a proper husband or male kin. That supposed marriage up in the hills don't count for nothing without official papers." Isaac's fingers tightened around his coffee cup. He'd seen enough of Jed's schemes to know this one would end in violence if not stopped. The saloon owner had never forgiven Oliver's public humiliation of him at the church. As twilight deepened into evening, Isaac waited until the crowd thinned before slipping out. Cold sleet pelted his face as he mounted up, pointing his pony toward the mountain trail. The weather was turning fierce, but he had to warn his friends. Up at the cabin, Charlotte sat at the rough-hewn table while Oliver worked on a piece of paper by lamplight. They'd spent the evening discussing possibilities for the trust land come spring. "If we cleared that meadow near the creek," Oliver was saying, sketching with a stub of pencil, "there'd be room enough for a proper schoolhouse. Nothing fancy, mind you, but solid. Good timber in these hills for building." Charlotte leaned closer, their shoulders nearly touching as she studied his drawing. "The orphans need more than just shelter and food," she said softly. "They need hope, a chance to learn." She traced the simple lines he'd drawn. "It would need a bell, I think. Every proper school should have a bell." Oliver smiled, a rare sight that transformed his weathered face. "Reckon we could manage that? Isaac knows some traders who—" He stopped suddenly, head cocked toward the window. Charlotte heard it too, the distant sound of horses moving through the trees. Oliver moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. The sleet had turned to heavy snow, reducing visibility to just a few yards. "See anything?" Charlotte whispered. "No." Oliver's voice was tight. "But someone's out there." He moved to the fireplace and lifted his rifle from its pegs, checking the load with practiced hands. "Might be nothing. Might be trouble." They waited in tense silence. The sounds faded, then disappeared completely. Only the wind remained, rattling the cabin's shutters and driving snow against the glass. Hours passed. Charlotte tried to sleep but found herself starting at every creak of the cabin's timbers. Oliver remained vigilant, moving between windows with the quiet skill of a man used to watching through the night. The first gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees when they heard it. A horse approaching at speed. Oliver positioned himself by the door, rifle ready, while Charlotte clutched the Bible from the mantel. "Oliver?" Isaac's voice carried through the pre-dawn gloom. "Charlotte, let me in. It's urgent." Oliver opened the door just enough to admit their friend. Isaac stumbled in, his clothes crusted with ice, his normally cheerful face grave. Charlotte hurried to pour him coffee, while Oliver secured the door. "Jed's coming," Isaac said between chattering teeth, wrapping his frozen hands around the hot cup. "Him and the marshal, plus however many men they can buy with whiskey. They've got papers claiming your marriage isn't legal, Charlotte. Without that, they say the land reverts to Jed because of Thomas's debts." Oliver's face hardened. "When?" "Today, I expect. They were drinking heavy when I left, but Jed seemed determined." Isaac took another swallow of coffee. "The marshal's with them this time. Makes it look official, even if it ain't right." Charlotte sank into a chair, her face pale. "They won't stop, will they? Not until they have everything." "No, ma'am," Isaac said gently. "Men like Jed, they feed on taking what ain't theirs. Each victory just makes them hunger for more." Oliver stood by the window, rifle cradled in his arms, watching the snow-covered valley below. His expression was unreadable, but Charlotte saw him mouth words silently. A prayer, she realized. "I won't kill unless I have to," he said finally, turning back to them. "Won't stain this land with blood if there's any other way." He looked at Charlotte. "But I mean to keep my promise to protect you and what's rightfully yours." Isaac nodded approvingly. "The Creator gives us strength not to destroy, but to preserve what is good." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. "I brought something that might help, if you're willing." From the pouch, he produced several strips of paper covered in Cherokee syllabary. "Messages from the tribal council," he explained. "They recognize your claim to the land, Charlotte, based on the trust for the orphans. Indian Territory courts might not mean much to Jed, but they carry weight with the territorial governor." Charlotte touched the papers reverently. "Thank you, Isaac, for everything you've done for us." "Ain't done yet," the Cherokee trader said with a slight smile. "Got a few more friends riding this way. Good men who believe in justice, even for a white woman and a mountain man." Oliver returned to the window. The sun was rising now, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. It would have been beautiful if not for the tension hanging in the air. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "there's something we need to talk about." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "If things go bad today, if it looks like we can't hold them off, I want you to take the hidden papers and ride for the mission station with Isaac. The sisters there will protect you until we can sort this proper." "No." Charlotte stood, her voice firm despite its softness. "I won't run anymore. This land was Thomas's dream, not just for himself, but for those children who lost everything in the mines. If we lose it, we lose their future too." She moved to stand beside him at the window. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Oliver looked down at her, something soft and wondering in his eyes. Isaac busied himself with his coffee cup, hiding a smile. "Together then," Oliver said. His free hand found hers, rough fingers gentle against her skin. "But I meant what I said about not wanting bloodshed. There's been too much of that in these mountains already. The good Lord tests our hearts in times like these," Isaac observed. "Shows us what we're really made of." He stood and moved to the door. "I'll keep watch from the ridge. My friends should be here by mid-morning if the weather holds." As Isaac disappeared into the snowy morning, Oliver and Charlotte began their preparations. They moved the most valuable items to the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards: the trust papers, Charlotte's deed, Thomas's Bible. Oliver positioned spare ammunition where he could reach it easily, while Charlotte filled canteens and packed bread and dried meat in case they needed to move quickly. Through it all, they moved in comfortable synchronization, as if they'd been partners for years instead of weeks. Sometimes their hands would brush, or their eyes would meet, and something unspoken would pass between them. Trust, perhaps, or something deeper neither was ready to name. Oliver kept returning to the window, scanning the valley below. The snow had stopped, leaving the world draped in white silence. Perfect tracking weather, he knew. If Jed and his men were coming, there would be no hiding their approach. "Whatever happens," he said suddenly, "I want you to know something." He turned to Charlotte, his eyes intense. "Meeting you, helping you, it woke something in me I thought was dead. Showed me there's still good worth fighting for in this world." Charlotte touched his arm gently. "You showed me the same thing. When Thomas died, I thought all hope died with him. But you and Isaac, you proved there are still good men in the world. Men who keep their word and fight for what's right." "Ain't nothing special about keeping your word," Oliver said gruffly, but his eyes were warm. "Just what a man's supposed to do." "Maybe that's what makes it special," Charlotte replied softly. "Doing what's right even when it's hard, even when it costs you something." They stood together at the window, watching the sun climb higher over the snow-covered mountains. In the distance, a lone eagle circled against the bright sky, free and unafraid. Charlotte found herself praying it was a sign that justice and mercy would prevail over greed and violence. But the morning was still young, and somewhere below, horses were moving through the snow toward their sanctuary. The test of their faith, and Oliver's vow of mercy, was yet to come. The first light of dawn painted the snow-covered ridge in gentle rose and gold. Charlotte stood at the window, watching the sun emerge behind the distant peaks, when the sharp crack of gunfire shattered the morning stillness. The sound echoed off the mountainsides like thunder. "Get down!" Oliver lunged across the room, pulling Charlotte away from the window just as another shot splintered the wooden frame where she'd been standing. His body sheltered hers as they crashed to the floor. More shots rang out, closer now. Oliver scrambled up, dragging Charlotte toward the trap door that led to the root cellar. "Down there," he ordered, his voice rough with urgency. "Stay quiet until I call you." Charlotte's hands trembled as she gripped the ladder rungs. The earthy darkness swallowed her as Oliver slammed the trapdoor shut above. Through the floorboards, she heard his boots crossing to the window, followed by the familiar sound of his rifle being cocked. 2 riders appeared at the edge of the clearing, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Oliver's warning shot kicked up snow inches from the lead horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly unseating its rider. "That's close enough," Oliver's voice carried clearly across the frozen ground. "Next one won't miss." The riders wheeled their mounts, seeking cover behind a stand of pines. More shots crackled through the morning air. Charlotte pressed herself against the cellar's earthen wall, clutching her hands together in silent prayer. Suddenly, glass shattered overhead, a stray bullet finding its mark in the cabin's window. Charlotte stifled a cry as she heard the tinkling cascade of broken panes hitting the floor above. The shooting continued for several more minutes before gradually falling silent. "Oliver," she called softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Stay put," he answered. "Might not be finished yet." Heavy footsteps approached the trap door, and Charlotte tensed until she recognized Isaac's voice. "Let her up, brother. They've pulled back for now." Oliver helped her climb out of the cellar. The cabin's interior was dusted with broken glass and splinters. The morning sun streamed through the shattered window, catching crystal shards that glittered like dangerous stars across the floor. Isaac stood by the door, his rifle ready. "Saw smoke signals from the valley," he said grimly. "Jed's gathering more men. He means to burn you out if he can't shoot you out." Charlotte's hand flew to her throat. "Burn the cabin? But it's all we have." Oliver's face hardened as he reloaded his rifle. "Better the cabin than our lives." He turned to Isaac. "What's our best move?" The Cherokee trader stepped away from the window, his expression thoughtful. "My winter camp lies 3 ridges east, hidden in a box canyon. Good shelter, well stocked. We can slip out at dusk, take the game trails they won't know about." "They'll be watching the obvious paths," Oliver agreed. He looked at Charlotte. "Can you ride in the dark?" She straightened her spine. "I can do whatever needs doing." "That's the spirit," Isaac said approvingly. He moved to the window, staying carefully to one side. "We should prepare now while we have light. They'll likely wait until afternoon to make another try." Oliver nodded. "Charlotte, help me with something." He knelt and pried up the floorboards near the hearth, revealing the hidden compartment where they'd stored the trust papers. Carefully, he withdrew the precious documents. "We'll leave copies here," he explained, pulling blank paper from his desk. "Make it look like we didn't have time to take everything. Might buy us a few hours head start when they finally rush the cabin." Charlotte understood. While Oliver kept watch, she and Isaac worked quickly to create convincing duplicates of the trust papers. They aged the fresh paper in the hearth's ashes, then carefully copied the essential details, just enough to look real at first glance. As the sun climbed higher, they gathered only what they could carry on horseback: ammunition, food, warm clothes, and the real documents. Oliver wrapped the trust papers in oiled cloth and helped Charlotte secure them inside her coat, close to her heart. The day passed in tense vigilance. Occasional shots rang out from the ridge, keeping them pinned down. By late afternoon, they smelled wood smoke, Jed's men building fires, preparing for a long siege. "Almost time," Isaac murmured as the sun began to sink. He had already slipped out twice to check their planned escape route and prepare the horses, hidden in a stand of thick pines behind the cabin. Charlotte looked around the cabin, her sanctuary these past weeks, knowing she might never see it again. The single chair where Oliver had sat, reading by lamplight. The hearth where they'd shared simple meals and simpler prayers. The loft where she'd first begun to feel safe again. "The cabin's just wood and nails," Oliver said softly, reading her thoughts. "Home is where decent folks stand together." She managed a small smile. "Thomas used to say something similar. Your husband was a wise man." Oliver checked his rifle one last time. "Isaac, you lead. I'll bring up the rear. Charlotte, stay close to Isaac and do exactly what he says." They waited until full dark, when the only light came from the stars and the distant glow of their enemies' campfires. Isaac eased the door open, and they slipped out one by one into the bitter cold. The horses stood quietly, already loaded with their meager supplies. Oliver helped Charlotte mount, then pressed something into her hands: Thomas's Bible, rescued from the cabin. She clutched it close, along with the documents that had brought them to this moment. "Lord," she whispered into the darkness, "grant us courage for whatever lies ahead." They moved like shadows through the trees, Isaac leading them along trails Charlotte could barely see. The horses stepped carefully, their hooves muffled by snow. Behind them, the cabin stood dark and silent, its broken window a hollow eye watching them vanish into the forest. Every snap of a twig made Charlotte's heart jump. Every distant cry of a night bird seemed like a warning. But gradually, the sounds of Jed's men faded behind them. The stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold, as they climbed higher into the mountains. Oliver dropped back occasionally to check for pursuit, but their tracks were already being filled by softly falling snow. God's mercy, Charlotte thought, sending weather to hide their trail. She touched the papers inside her coat, feeling their weight against her chest. More than just documents, they represented a sacred trust, hope for orphaned children, justice in a harsh land, proof that some promises were worth any sacrifice to keep. The night deepened around them as they rode single file through the sleeping forest. Charlotte felt strangely peaceful despite their flight. Perhaps it was the quiet strength of the two men flanking her, or perhaps it was simply knowing they had chosen the right path, no matter the cost. They had lost the cabin, yes, but they had kept their conscience. And in that thought, she found courage enough to face whatever dawn might bring. Isaac led them steadily eastward as the stars traced their ancient paths overhead. The only sounds were the soft crunch of snow beneath hooves and the whisper of wind in the pines. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay shelter and safety, but for now they were travelers between worlds, guided by faith and starlight. Oliver's voice carried softly from behind. "You doing all right, Charlotte?" "Yes," she answered, and found she meant it. Despite everything, she felt stronger than she had in months. "I'm ready for whatever comes next." The trail wound deeper into the mountains as the night grew older. Charlotte held the trusted papers close, feeling them pulse against her heart like a second heartbeat. Though they had left safety behind, she knew they carried something far more precious: hope, justice, and the promise of a better tomorrow. The stars continued their stately dance overhead as three riders moved through the wilderness, each step taking them further from the past and closer to whatever future God had planned. Though the path ahead was uncertain, they faced it together, armed with faith, courage, and the unshakable conviction that doing right was worth any price. The journey through the mountain night ended as dawn's first gray light touched the eastern sky. Isaac led them down a narrow trail that wound through snow-laden pines toward the sound of rushing water. As they descended, Charlotte caught glimpses of the Elk River through the trees, its surface a mix of ice and dark, flowing water. "Almost there," Isaac called back softly. "Lodge is just beyond that next ridge." The horses picked their way carefully down the slope. Charlotte's mount was tired, its breath steaming in the cold morning air. Oliver rode close behind her, watchful as ever. Though they hadn't seen signs of pursuit, his rifle remained ready across his saddle. Isaac's winter lodge appeared suddenly around a bend, a sturdy log structure tucked against a cliff face that sheltered it from the worst winds. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, and Charlotte saw fresh tracks in the snow around the building. "My nephew tends the place when I'm trading," Isaac explained, dismounting. "He'll have kept the fire going." A young Cherokee man emerged from the lodge, relief visible on his face when he recognized his uncle. They spoke briefly in their own language, the nephew's eyes widening as Isaac explained their situation. He immediately moved to help with the horses. Inside, the lodge was warm and welcoming. A fire blazed in a large stone hearth, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. Furs lined the walls, and Charlotte saw evidence of Isaac's trading everywhere: stacked blankets, tools, dried foods, and medicine bundles. "It ain't fancy," Isaac said, "but it's safe. Jed's men won't find this place." "It's wonderful," Charlotte replied sincerely. After their cold night ride, the lodge felt like paradise. Oliver helped her settle their belongings, while Isaac and his nephew tended to the horses. The trust papers were carefully stored in a cedar chest, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. Charlotte sank gratefully onto a bench near the fire, exhaustion finally catching up with her. As morning progressed, Isaac's nephew brought news that a storm was approaching. Sure enough, by midday, heavy clouds had rolled in, and snow began to fall. The wind picked up, whistling around the lodge's corners. "Roof needs some work before this hits proper," Isaac observed, pointing out places where previous storms had loosened the logs. "Best we fix it now." Despite their weariness, Oliver and Isaac set to work immediately. Charlotte insisted on helping, passing up tools and holding logs in place while the men secured them. The physical labor felt good after so many hours in the saddle, and working together created a sense of purpose. Snow fell steadily as they labored, but the men's experienced hands made quick work of the repairs. By late afternoon, the roof was sound, and they retreated inside just as the storm intensified. Isaac's nephew had prepared a hearty stew of dried meat and roots, which they ate gratefully around the fire. As evening settled in, Charlotte found herself thinking of Reverend Dobbins back in Cold Creek. The poor man had tried to protect her in his own weak way, and she felt he deserved to know the truth. "I need to write a letter," she announced, reaching for her small writing case, one of the few possessions she'd managed to save. "To Reverend Dobbins. He should understand why we fled, about the trust papers and the orphan's rights." Oliver looked concerned. "Might be dangerous, sending word back to town." "The Reverend's a good man at heart," Charlotte insisted. "He's just afraid. If he knows the full story, he might find his courage again. We need allies who can speak the truth." Isaac nodded slowly. "My nephew could deliver it. He knows how to avoid being seen when needed." Charlotte wrote by firelight, choosing her words carefully. She explained about Thomas's secret trust, how the land was meant to support children left parentless by mining accidents. She described Jed's attempts to steal it all through forced marriage, and Oliver's intervention to protect both her and the trust's intended purpose. Finally, she appealed to the Reverend's conscience, asking him to be a moral witness to the truth. "When truth stays silent," she wrote, "lies grow bold." She signed it and sealed the letter with a drop of wax from Isaac's trading supplies. Isaac's nephew would leave at first light, taking back trails and game paths to reach Cold Creek. The journey would take several days, but he seemed confident in his ability to move undetected. Later that night, as the storm raged outside, Charlotte noticed Oliver sitting alone by the fire, lost in thought. The others had retired to their sleeping places, leaving just the two of them awake. Something in his expression spoke of deep sadness. She moved to sit beside him, offering silent company. For a long while, there was only the crack of burning wood and the howl of wind outside. "I had a fiancée once," Oliver said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah was her name. We were to be married in the spring of '68. Charlotte felt her heart tighten, sensing the pain in his words. "Bandits hit the stage she was traveling on," he continued. "I'd asked her to visit my sister in Denver, help with a new baby." His hands clenched. "Should have gone with her. Should have been there." "Oh, Oliver," Charlotte breathed, understanding now his years of solitude, his reluctance to let anyone close. "Found out later they didn't even want anything from the passengers, just angry men taking their spite out on innocent folks." He stared into the flames. "After that, I didn't want to risk carrying that much again. Figured it was safer up here, alone with my traps in the mountains." Without thinking, Charlotte reached out and took his hand. It was rough with calluses, strong from years of hard work, but it trembled slightly in hers. She remembered her own grief after Thomas died, the terrible emptiness of loss. "The heart doesn't heal by staying closed," she said softly. "Thomas taught me that. Even when he was dying, he worried more about others, about the orphans, about me. He said love was worth any risk. Oliver's fingers tightened around hers. They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned lower, each lost in memories but drawing comfort from the other's presence. No words of love were spoken aloud, but something shifted between them in that quiet hour. A recognition of shared pain, shared understanding, and perhaps shared hope. The storm continued through the night, but inside Isaac's lodge, two wounded souls found a measure of peace. Charlotte thought of all the twists of fate that had brought them to this moment. Thomas's letter, Jed's cruelty, Oliver's intervention, their flight through the snow. God's ways were mysterious indeed, weaving purpose even through life's darkest threads. When the candle burned low, casting soft shadows on the lodge's walls, they finally parted for sleep. But something had changed. Some wall had crumbled, leaving them both vulnerable yet stronger for the sharing. Outside, the wind sang. Through the pines, and snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and sealing them away from the world in this mountain sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had found safety, understanding, and the first tentative steps toward healing. Isaac's lodge creaked softly in the wind, a solid shelter against the storm. Charlotte lay awake for a while, listening to the fire's dying crackles and the steady breathing of her companions. Her hand still felt warm where it had held Oliver's, and her heart was full of a feeling she wasn't quite ready to name. She thought of the letter making its way to Reverend Dobbins, carrying truth through the wilderness. Perhaps he too would find courage, as she and Oliver were slowly finding healing. God's grace, she reflected, worked in unexpected ways, turning even their darkest moments toward light. Sleep finally came as the storm began to ease, and peace settled over the lodge like a blanket of new-fallen snow. A week passed at Isaac's lodge with no sign of trouble. The days fell into a gentle rhythm, morning prayers, shared meals, and quiet conversations by the fire. But peace, like spring ice, could crack without warning. Oliver stood on the northern ridge that morning, scanning the horizon out of habit. The sun had barely cleared the mountains when he saw it. A dark column of smoke rising against the pale winter sky. His chest tightened. He knew exactly where that smoke was coming from. "Isaac," he called, his voice rough. The Cherokee trader joined him, following his gaze to the distant smudge against the clouds. "Your cabin," Isaac confirmed quietly. "Jed's men, most likely. They're sending a message." Oliver's jaw clenched until it ached. The cabin had been his sanctuary for 10 years. A place of solitude, yes, but also of healing. Now it was becoming ash, another piece of his life torn away by violence. He heard soft footsteps in the snow behind him. Charlotte had followed them up, wrapped in a borrowed blanket. When she saw the smoke, her hand flew to her mouth. "No," she whispered. "Oh, no." The smoke continued to rise, dark and steady. Charlotte's eyes filled with tears as she watched their refuge burn. That cabin had been more than shelter. It had been the first place since Thomas's death where she'd felt truly safe, where she'd begun to trust again. "All those memories," she said, her voice breaking. "The chair by the fire, the Bible on the mantel, the loft where I slept." A sob escaped her. It was becoming home. Oliver moved closer, wanting to comfort her but unsure how. His own grief felt like a stone in his throat. Isaac touched his shoulder. "I'll ride closer, see what I can learn." He mounted his horse and disappeared into the trees, leaving Oliver and Charlotte alone with their loss. The smoke grew thinner as the morning wore on, but Charlotte couldn't tear her eyes away. Oliver watched her shoulders shake with silent tears and felt something shift inside him, grief transforming into resolve. By late afternoon, Isaac returned with confirmation of their fears. "Jed's men," he reported grimly. 3 of them. They made sure nothing was left standing. Charlotte pressed her hands to her face, trying to stifle fresh tears. Oliver's expression hardened as Isaac continued. "There's more," the traitor said. "In town, Jed and Marshall Tate are spreading a story. They're calling it a rescue mission now, claiming Oliver took Charlotte as an unwilling wife, that they need to save her from an outlaw husband." "That's ridiculous," Charlotte burst out. "Anyone who knows Oliver—" "Truth matters little to men like Jed," Isaac said quietly. "They shape stories to serve their greed." As evening approached, Oliver disappeared into the woods. He returned carrying 2 sturdy pine boards and some tools from Isaac's lodge. Working by firelight, he fashioned a crude but solid cross, his hands moving with quiet purpose. Charlotte watched him work, understanding dawning in her eyes. When he finished, he helped her into her coat, and together they walked to a small rise overlooking the valley. The moon was rising, casting everything in silver light. Oliver planted the cross firmly in the frozen ground. From his pocket, he drew a knife and carefully carved words into the wood. "Faith's beginning." Charlotte touched the rough letters, tears freezing on her cheeks. "Why those words?" "Because sometimes," Oliver said softly, "we have to lose everything to find what matters most." He looked at her in the moonlight. "I'll rebuild it one day when this is over. Better than before. A proper home." The promise in his words wrapped around them both like a warm blanket. Charlotte leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. Together they stood before the cross, marking not just the loss of a cabin, but the birth of something new, a faith that could survive fire and betrayal. Below in the valley, Jed and Marshall Tate were weaving their lies, planning their rescue. But up here on the ridge, under stars and silence, Oliver and Charlotte found their own truth. Their home had burned, but their bond, forged in crisis, tempered by loss, only grew stronger. The cross stood as their witness, its shadow stretching across the snow like a promise. Faith's beginning, indeed, not just in God's providence, but in each other. 2 mornings after the cabin burned, frost coated the ground like sugar. Oliver shouldered his rifle before dawn, determined to bring back fresh venison. The winter stores were running low, and Charlotte needed proper meals to keep up her strength. He checked the loaded weapon one last time, then nodded to Isaac, who sat whittling by the morning fire. "I'll be back before midday," Oliver said quietly, careful not to wake Charlotte, who still slept in Isaac's spare tent. "Stay alert." Isaac gave a slight nod. "The spirits are restless today, brother. Watch your path." Oliver disappeared into the silver-gray forest, following deer trails he'd spotted the evening before. The crisp air carried the promise of another storm, but for now, the sky remained clear. He hadn't gone more than 2 miles when the first shot rang out. Back at camp, Charlotte had just emerged from her tent, warming her hands by the fire when hoofbeats thundered through the trees. Before Isaac could reach his rifle, 4 riders burst into the clearing, Jed Lawton at their lead. "Well, ain't this cozy?" Jed sneered, his breath clouding in the cold air. His eyes gleamed with malice as he spotted Charlotte. "Time to come home, Mrs. Lawton." Isaac stepped between them, his hands raised. "This is Cherokee land, Lawton. You have no authority here." "Ain't asking for permission, Indian." Jed spat the word like poison. 2 men dismounted, moving to flank Isaac. Charlotte backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked desperately toward the trees, willing Oliver to appear. "Leave him be!" she cried, as one of Jed's men raised his rifle butt. The blow caught Isaac on the temple with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the frozen ground, blood seeping into the frost. Charlotte screamed, but rough hands seized her arms before she could run. Jed dismounted, strutting over to where Charlotte struggled against his men. His fingers dug into her chin as he forced her to look at him. "Your mountain hero ain't here to save you now, and when he shows his face in Cold Creek, he'll swing for kidnapping." "He never kidnapped me," Charlotte spat. "You're the one who—" A sharp slap cut off her words. "Shut your mouth, woman. Marshall's got a nice trial planned. Real public affair." Jed's grin turned cruel. "Time folks learned what happens to men who cross me." They dragged her toward the horses. Charlotte fought every step, but it was no use. As they lifted her onto Jed's saddle, she saw Isaac stir slightly. Thank God he was alive. "Leave him," Jed ordered, when one of his men raised his gun toward the wounded Cherokee. "He ain't worth the bullet. Besides, I want him alive to tell that mountain man where to find us." The riders thundered away, Charlotte bouncing helplessly before Jed. Her last glimpse of the camp showed Isaac's crumpled form by the dying fire, steam rising from his blood in the morning air. An hour later, Oliver returned to camp, a young deer across his shoulders. The moment he saw the trampled snow and overturned cooking pot, he dropped his burden and ran to Isaac's side. "Brother," he breathed, gently turning Isaac over. The Cherokee's face was caked with blood, but his chest rose and fell steadily. Isaac's eyes fluttered open. "Oliver," he gasped. "Jed, 4 men, took her." Oliver's hands clenched into fists. The rage he'd carried since his first love's death roared to life, demanding blood for blood. But Isaac's weak grip on his arm pulled him back from that dark precipice. "Where?" Oliver managed through gritted teeth. "Cold Creek," Isaac wheezed. "Public. Trial. Wants to hang you. When you come for her." Oliver helped Isaac sit up, pressing a clean cloth to his wound. His mind raced with violent possibilities, ambush points, rifle angles, all the ways he could end Jed Lawton's evil. But Thomas's letter burned in his pocket, reminding him of his promise to protect, not destroy. The sun crept over the mountains as Oliver tended Isaac's injury. When the bleeding slowed, he helped his friend into the tent and gathered his weapons. The rage still simmered, but something stronger took hold, a quiet certainty born of faith. Kneeling in the trampled snow, Oliver closed his eyes. "Lord," he whispered, "let me bring her home without sin." The prayer settled over him like a mantle, cooling his anger without dampening his resolve. As dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Oliver saddled his horse. He checked his rifle one last time, then swung into the saddle. Isaac watched from the tent opening, understanding in his dark eyes. "Remember," the Cherokee called softly, "a warrior's greatest strength is knowing when not to strike." Oliver nodded once, then turned his horse toward Cold Creek. The morning wind carried the scent of snow, and somewhere ahead, Charlotte waited. He would find her, and by God's grace, he would do it without staining his soul. Oliver hunched low against his horse's neck as sleet stung his face. The mountain passes turned treacherous with ice, but he pressed on through the endless night. His mount's hooves found sure footing despite the darkness, guided by providence or plain stubbornness. Oliver reckoned it didn't much matter which. Near dawn, exhaustion forced him to rest. He tethered his horse and huddled beneath a towering pine, allowing himself 1 hour of fitful sleep. The cold kept him from deeper rest, but even that brief pause restored some strength to his weary bones. Back on the trail, he encountered Joe Wheeler, the mail rider, watering his horse at a stream. "They're holding the trial tomorrow morning," Joe told him, eyes worried. "Whole town's talking about nothing else." Meanwhile, Charlotte shivered beneath a musty tarp in Jed's wagon, her wrists raw from rope burns. Each bump and jolt brought fresh pain, but she clung to memories of Oliver's quiet strength. "The Lord provides," he'd told her once. She whispered those words now like a shield against despair. As dusk painted the sky purple, Oliver finally glimpsed Cold Creek's church steeple. He led his horse into a grove of cottonwoods near the old church, concealing them both from prying eyes. Now he would wait for full darkness and pray his plan would be enough. Morning light filtered through the saloon's grimy windows as townsfolk packed the room shoulder to shoulder. The smell of stale whiskey and wood smoke hung heavy in the air. Jed Lawton strutted before the crowd, yanking Charlotte forward by her bound wrists. "This here's my legal bride," Jed announced, his voice carrying to every corner. "These papers prove it!" Marshal Tate stepped forward, waving documents with an official-looking seal. Reverend Dobbins stood near the back, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his silence. His fingers worried the worn edges of his Bible, shame etched deep in the lines of his face. The saloon doors burst open with a bang. Cold wind and swirling snow swept in as Oliver Boone stepped inside. Ice crusted his coat, but his movements were steady and deliberate. The room fell silent as he carefully set his rifle on the floor and raised his hands. "I came for truth, not blood," Oliver declared, his voice quiet but firm. From behind him emerged Isaac Red Elk, his face bruised but his eyes fierce with purpose. He held up a leather folder. "Here's the real trust deed," Isaac announced. "Shows the land belongs to the orphans, with Mrs. Hensley as trustee." Whispers rippled through the crowd as Jed's face darkened with fury. The truth was finally coming to light. Jed's hand darted for his gun, but Oliver moved like lightning. With one swift motion, he struck Jed's arm aside, sending the weapon clattering across the wooden floor. No shots were fired. Marshal Tate, seeing the tide turn, slumped against the bar. "The papers," he muttered, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. "They were forged. All of them." The revelation sent gasps through the crowd. Reverend Dobbins stumbled forward, his legs giving way as he fell to his knees. "Lord, forgive me," he sobbed, hands clasped. "I knew it was wrong. My silence, my terrible silence." The townsfolk pressed in around Jed, their faces dark with anger at his deception. Above their angry murmurs, Reverend Dobbins struggled to his feet. "We must make this right," he declared. "A true marriage before God and these witnesses." Snow drifted through the broken shutters, dusting the scene in white as Oliver turned to Charlotte. His weathered face broke into a tender grin. "This is not your wedding?" His voice caught with emotion. "It's ours." As they spoke their vows, the church bell began to toll across the street. The crowd bowed their heads, humbled by this glimpse of grace rising from darkness. Here was decency reborn, divine justice wrapped in love's simple truth. Warm April sunlight danced across the valley, melting the last stubborn patches of snow around the newly rebuilt cabin. The fresh-cut pine logs gleamed golden in the morning light, their sweet sap scent mingling with wood smoke from the chimney. Where destruction had reigned months before, new life sprouted from the earth like God's own promise fulfilled. Charlotte stood in the doorway of the small schoolhouse, her heart full as she watched children scrambling up the path. The building sat perfectly beside the clear creek, its windows catching the morning sun. Inside, rough-hewn benches waited for their first students, sons and daughters of miners, along with 3 orphans who'd already claimed her heart as their own. "Good morning, Miss Charlotte," they called, though some still stumbled over Mrs. Boone. Their eager faces brought tears to her eyes as they filed in, clutching worn primers and fresh slate boards. Oliver worked steadily outside, putting the finishing touches on a long bench beneath the schoolhouse window. His strong hands moved with careful precision, smoothing the wood just so. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to Charlotte through the window, and a quiet smile would cross his weathered face. The sound of her sweet voice leading the children in hymns drifted out to him on the spring breeze. "Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine," the young voices sang, some wobbling off-key but all sincere. Charlotte's clear tone guided them true, just as she led their letters and numbers with patient care. By mid-morning, the jingling of harness bells announced Isaac Red Elk's arrival. He led a string of laden mules up the narrow trail, their packs bulging with supplies for the school and settlement. His familiar laugh rolled across the yard as he called out greetings in Cherokee and English. "The Lord provides," Isaac said, helping Oliver unload slates and books. "These came all the way from Kansas City." His eyes crinkled with pleasure at the children's excitement over the deliveries. Near noon, Reverend Dobbins made his way up from town, leaning on his cane but stepping lighter than he had in years. The burden of silence lifted from his shoulders had given him new strength. He carried his Bible and a small silver bell for the school, a gift from the repentant townspeople. "Gather round," the Reverend called, and everyone assembled in the spring sunshine. Charlotte stood beside Oliver, who wrapped one strong arm around her shoulders. The children formed a circle, fidgeting but attentive, as Reverend Dobbins raised his hands in blessing. "Lord, let this place be a fountain of wisdom and grace," he prayed. "May these children grow in knowledge and faith, and may all who enter here find your light." The simple words carried on the breeze like a promise. As the sun began its westward slide, Oliver and Charlotte walked together along the ridge trail. New grass pushed through the rocky soil, and the first wildflowers dotted the slope with purple and gold. Far below, the valley stretched green and fresh, washed clean by spring rains and redemption. Oliver paused at their favorite outlook, his voice rough with gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for second chances," he prayed aloud, "for new beginnings and your endless mercy." Charlotte slipped her small hand into his calloused one, her wedding ring catching the evening light. "We were never lost," she said softly, "just waiting to be found." In the distance, a train whistle echoed off the mountains, a far-off reminder of the world beyond their valley. But here, in the growing dusk, peace settled like a blessing. The schoolhouse stood as testament to love's victory. The cabin glowed with welcome, and the land itself seemed to rest in God's good grace. Isaac's voice carried up from below, singing an old Cherokee hymn as he tended his mules. The children's laughter faded toward home, and evening's first star appeared above the peaks. Another day of miracles drew to its close in the high country, where faith had made all things new. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.